Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
We assume that's the Bahamas. 544 miles per hour, 46, 56 degrees.
Dr. Kent Kirkby.
Okay, to be honest now, when he says he was happy to have me here tonight, you don't realize how happy. The first three people he wanted couldn't make it. I'm still happy that it worked out that way because actually I have a connection with this film. When I was 7 years old, I first discovered dinosaurs. You've got to remember that back inside that time, dinosaurs, we didn't have Jurassic Park, so it was something that was a little bit different. So I discovered dinosaurs, and the next year, this ended up actually being the very first, sorry, I have to switch these around, the very first movie that I ever attended without my parents. And so I was 8 years old. My parents wanted nothing to do with the movie. So as a result, a friend and I walked down about a mile from our house down to the old Egyptian Theater inside Milwaukee, went inside, and we attended the movie. It was mesmerizing to me because I had never been to a movie theater without my parents, and I walked into this cavernous movie theater, and I didn't realize until I looked on the internet it held 1,800 people. It had 1,800 kids in it, not a single adult. None of the parents wanted anything to do with the movie on it. So it was a huge cavernous thing, but the audience in those days was strictly on one side of things, and that was they were all on Team Kong. I mean, they really liked Kong on this entirely. In 1963, King Kong was much, much more popular than Godzilla. In this theater, it would be riotous thunder every time the King Kong was winning. And then when Godzilla began to win, it dropped off to silence with just one voice cheering Godzilla on. My friend actually got up and left me alone because he was afraid to be associated with me on this one on it. But that was when I was a kid. As an adult, it's sort of interesting to think about, well, how would these monsters stack up against real-life monsters out there, like some of the sauropods or the largest theropod dinosaurs? And now the nice thing is that Hollywood has already done at least one of these matchups for us. It put King Kong against T-Rex inside Jackson's film, inside 2005, and in the original King Kong movie. And this one, I really like Jackson's adaptation on this because he realized that King Kong, the original story, was a love story. It was a love story between a woman and her giant ape. A love story then moves to New York, and like most love stories in New York, ends rather badly. So this sort of raises the question of, well, what killed King Kong? Now, as a scientist, I can tell you the movie got it wrong. It wasn't the planes that killed King Kong. King Kong died long before the planes ever came in contact with King Kong. And no, it wasn't beauty that killed King Kong. At the end of the movie, Jack Black's character says, "Beauty killed the beast." Well, come on, it's Jack Black. Why would you believe anything he said? I mean, it doesn't make any sense on it. But it also wasn't the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs never had a chance to do it with King Kong either. So something else was trying to do this. And so I'll just give you a hint on it. Oops, sorry about that. Just a hint. Basically, when you go from big tropical mammals like lions and gorillas up to really big tropical mammals like rhinos and elephants, something's missing. Well, what is it? This is audience participation. What? Well, what we're missing as far as in the animals, what are they missing? What do the big ones have that the really big ones are lacking? Fur. Absolutely right. And so that gives you an idea of what killed King Kong. Heat stroke did. When you are a big animal, and a big warm-blooded animal, you have to get rid of heat. That's the thing that actually can cause the biggest problems on it. When we're talking about elephants, apart from human poaching, the leading cause of death for elephants is heat stroke. The only way they can get rid of heat are by those big ears, which is why elephants have large ears. It increases the surface area to body volume ratio so they can actually shed excess heat. Well, then the question arises that if the leading cause of death for that animal is heat stroke, well, how could a warm-blooded animal that's several times the size of an elephant still exist? And the catch is when you actually look at the design of these animals, it's quite different. When you look at an elephant, remember that the only way the elephant can get rid of heat is by its ears. But when you look at the design of the sauropods, there's actually lots of things that increase their surface area. They have those magnificent necks, the long tails, tall pillar-like legs. All these things increase the surface area to body volume ratio of the animal and allow it to shed excess heat. Well, these things are actually very well designed for it. Now, when you look at any of the big dinosaurs, there's always some sort of feature that's designed for heat shedding. So when I was a kid, the plates in the Stegosaurus were just for defense. Now, I played with plastic dinosaurs a lot. No, actually, I have to be honest. I played with plastic dinosaurs constantly. And I can tell you that this doesn't make any sense. These plates are still leaving the whole side of the animal open. You can always rip open the animal there. And then, as an adult, I realized, well, these plates even have channels for blood vessels on them. Now, this would be like getting in a fight with a pit bull and trying to force it away from you by shoving your jugular at it. I mean, it's not the best working plan on it. These things are covered by blood vessels. It's not what you're going to want to throw inside the way of a theropod's teeth. Instead, these are beautifully designed to shed heat. The same thing with ceratopsian frills. Again, when I was a kid, the frill was there for defense, to protect the neck. Well, the bone in these frills is less than half an inch. There's nothing that's going to protect the neck, and they're actually lined by blood vessels that are going out, again, shedding a lot of blood to the frill just to cool it off and allow the animal to shed heat. And some of the sauropods weren't content with long necks and long tails. They added even a frill along the back to just increase surface area. So all the big dinosaurs have some sort of heat-shedding feature involved. Now, when you look at the T-Rexes that faced off against King Kong, again, those magnificent tails back there, the same feature that allowed them to be bipedal also increases their surface area and allows them to shed heat. Well, what about King Kong? Well, if we look at King Kong, we got a problem. I mean, you're talking about an animal that's basically a ball on sticks. It's covered in fur, has a barrel chest. It doesn't make any way for this animal to get rid of heat. In fact, the only feature on this animal that could increase its surface area to shed heat are those long forelimbs, and they're covered with the thickest fur. There isn't any way that King Kong could exist. He would die of heat stroke. Now, when we've got this movie here, again, you've got to remember that that one over there did exist. They were very successful. They worked really well. But the other big animal on the screen, well, it would be dead on arrival. There just isn't any way for trying to do this. Now, what about Godzilla? Well, when you look at Godzilla, look at that. Magnificent. It's got 3 lines of plates going in the back. Now, when I was a kid, I just thought those were there to make Godzilla look cool. As an adult and as a scientist, I can tell you they're there to make Godzilla actually be cool. It's a way of shedding heat on things entirely on it. So this works out rather nicely. So in the first round, as far as being a big monster dealing with nature, in the first round with heat, King Kong versus Godzilla, it's a knockout in the very first round. There isn't any way that King Kong, a big ape like King Kong, could really exist. Godzilla at least manages to survive the first round on this, which is actually probably just as well, considering when we get to the second round, we're talking about gravity. And if poor King Kong had survived the first round, this would be a terrible way to go. Because when you're talking about gravity, you can't just take the size, the shape, and design of a small animal and supersize it. It doesn't work. In this real life, if you had this giant mouse there, the very first time it moves, it would break off all of its toes and break every limb and joint within its body. And so all you could basically do is try and put the poor thing out of its misery. You can't just simply scale up. When we're talking about big animals, for really big animals, their limbs have to be basically vertical pillars, trying to hold the mass of the animal. So in an elephant, those legs just go straight down. There's no bends, no curves within them at all. When they're standing still, their legs are just pillars to support the mass. And sure, elephants can rear up. In fact, they can do so on all sorts of things, like circuses and stuff like that. But they do all of this very, very carefully, because for an animal the size of an elephant, a fall can be deadly. So they don't do things fast. Anything that could go wrong could be the last thing that they do. So as wonderful as the internet is, this sort of thing just really does not take place at all. We don't see elephants doing things like that. When we look at sauropods, they have the same design as elephants. They have basically elephant-like legs, except you've got to realize that elephants actually have sauropod-like legs, because the sauropods were here first, did it before elephants ever evolved. So they have straight-line legs going down, pillars just kind of holding up the mass of the body. And even when they walk, we're talking about pretty stiff-legged gait, long, straight limbs. You don't put a lot of bends in when you're this heavy and this massive. Now, that's different than like the smaller theropods. When you look at the smaller theropods and the way their limbs are moving, they've got all these nice joints going back and forth and lots of bends within them because they're an animal like a modern cat that has to rely on speed, movement, leaping, jumping, but they're not nearly the mass of the sauropod. Well, again, when we look at King Kong, that should just hurt. Any of you I've torn out my knee. And when you look at something like this, I wince every time I do. Because when you think about how this animal is supporting its weight, it has all these bends, everything else within it. And for an animal this size, you've got to realize that 30 seconds after this photograph was taken, every single one of those joints failed catastrophically. And, poor, King Kong would just be lying there on the ground in agony. So actually, it's nice that heat stroke occurred. I mean, it's a much better way to go than this sort of thing. Now, when you look at Godzilla, well, surprisingly, I didn't realize it, but Godzilla's pretty well designed for this. The limbs are going straight down. And when Godzilla walks, as a kid, I always thought he had sort of a stiff-legged walk, but actually it's really beautifully designed for carrying around a big, heavy mass. So Godzilla does pretty good when we're talking about on the gravity side as well. But there's something that's still troubling here. When you look at this, if you look at like Shakespeare's 7 stages of man, and then you compare it to Godzilla, you realize Godzilla is not a buff monster at all. In fact, when you look at this, you realize Godzilla is middle-aged. Now, it's got to be middle-aged. And, you don't believe me? Look at the way he dances. Only a middle-aged male could think that this works. There isn't any other way on this sort of thing. So he's middle-aged. He's overweight. Well, even though King Kong died in the heat round and would have hated to be inside the gravity round, you've got to wonder whether Godzilla is going to meet his match in the 3rd round. When you're middle-aged, overweight, what about heart disease? What's the possibility there? Now, I'm not a medical doctor, but that's what we have Google for. So if you look in and you type up heart disease in Google, what you very quickly come to is the apple versus pear story. And the idea on this is that if you have an apple-shaped body where your weight is carried above the waistline versus a pear-shaped body where your weight is below the waistline, well, those with an apple-shaped body face a greatly increased risk of heart disease. Those with a pear-shaped body face no significant increase inside heart disease. So if we look at Godzilla, well, Godzilla doesn't share any risk of heart disease. He is the ultimate pear-bodied shape on this sort of thing. So he's going to make it through this round as well. But there's still something that's definitely different here in terms of heat shedding. When you look at the theropod, narrow legs, narrow tail. You look at Godzilla, really thick, bulky legs, really thick, bulky tail. This is a big bottom animal. And it's very different than dinosaurs. This is one of the big things that's really different about dinosaurs. And this bothered me a lot until I realized that there's a second difference between Godzilla and dinosaurs. And that's, atomic breath. So we come to atomic breath, and I got to tell you that as a scientist, this one I have a lot of problems with. I have to sort of the movie people tell me it has atomic breath. We see it set all sorts of things ablaze. But there's just something that bothers me as a scientist about an animal having atomic breath. First off, I don't really understand why atomic breath causes everything to burst into flames. I could see that, things would die of radiation or something else, but why do they burst into flames? So I was sort of proposing maybe it's just excess body heat that we're trying to get rid of from a big-bottomed animal. So regardless of whether it's actually atomic breath or heat breath, there's got to be some sort of scorch marks out there. So then the question is, did dinosaurs have these? So you can try and find scorch marks. I have scoured the literature since they asked me to come and give this talk, and I can guarantee you that there is no evidence of atomic breath scorch marks anywhere inside Mesozoic rock. Dinosaurs did not have them. Dinosaurs did not have big butts. So as a result, if there's only 2 major differences, possibly these things are related. So the only way I can try and explain Godzilla's breath would be one possibility is that simply evolution is amazing. It can take something that would basically be a potential weakness in an animal and turn it into an awesome weapon. So this is going to be my only possible premise is what I'm going to be calling, he's got the fire down below Godzilla hypothesis. And yes, patent is pending. Don't try and print this, Now, yeah, you're laughing, but in the present administration, this may be the only science that's funded. So, it's something that, go on. But seriously, although the audience back in 1963 was all definitely Team Kong, I've got to tell you that in terms of science, Mother Nature loves Godzilla. It's just something that Godzilla would work a little bit better. Not 400 feet tall, but if you're talking about like a 35-foot Godzilla monster, it's something that actually is a whole lot more feasible. There isn't any way for a 35-foot gorilla simply because of heat loss, mass, and everything else. But regardless of which team you're on, I hope that you enjoy the movie. But in honor of the night being a science and evening and everything else, while we're watching it, take a moment now and then to at least consider the science behind the monsters.